Clapper board. You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled, "The Predator Sent Its Cubs to a Human for Training. They Returned Unrecognizable HFY." Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. The planet bled light into the darkness as if trying to sew shut a wound in the night. Yardarm Nebula hung like torn silk above a horizon of black-mirrored ice, and the wind that crossed the valley came carrying the voices of 1,000 hunts, old victories steeped into frozen stone. In that wind, the children of predators breathed and watched, listening for the thing they had come to find, the human who had been promised. They were 5, born under different eclipses of the Karak moon, fur like inks and embers, eyes that cut the dark. The oldest, Vekar, had scars that ran down his cheek like cracking frost. He led with the silence of a knife drawn before dawn. Selly and Jaxra moved like twin echoes, one a step ahead in curiosity, one a step behind in suspicion. Kren, broad-shouldered, carried the solemnity of a new-minted oath, and little Ree, smallest of the litter, his ears still growing into the shape of adults, moved braver than he believed and more fragile than he would admit. Their mother, Sar'Lai of the Scarlet Range, Starbreaker and Wolf of the Red Vortex, had delivered them to this ice valley not with affection, but with a ceremony so clinical it made breath taste of iron. She had bowed her head once, not deep to them but deep enough to history, before she pulled back her lips and spoke in the old voice before the stars. "I send my blood to be broken," she had whispered. "So it may be tempered. Return them to me not as cubs, but as a shape the galaxy does not expect." The human lived alone in a long house of stone and polymer, half buried into the slope. Smoke rose from a vent on the leeward side, carrying a smell they hadn't known, a mineral sweetness like sun after rain. The door was not a door. It was a scar in the wall that widened only when someone told it something safe. Vekar told it nothing. He pressed his palm against it. He heard a click. He heard the human say from somewhere deeper than hearing, "Enter." They entered. The human sat at a table with its back to them, steam curling from a cup. No armor, no weapons that Vekar could see, only a threadbare sweater, sleeves rolled to elbows, scars like maps across the forearms. But the room had tools in the corners, straps and weights, coils of line, a simulator helmet hung like a skull above a rack of woven mats. Every wall had a story hidden in it. Every beam had teeth. The human didn't turn at first. It finished its sip, placed the cup down, and let silence ripen until the cubs shifted, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar sensation that someone else controlled the pace of the hunt. "I'm Mason Hale," the human said then, standing. He faced them, and his eyes were not predator eyes. They were tide eyes, moving, measuring, carrying the memory of distant storms. "Your mother called me teacher. I once had other names." "We don't need a teacher," Kren said softly. "We need an edge." "Edges dull," Mason replied, equally soft. "Wills don't." Selly's ears twitched. "You speak like our elders." "I've outlived most of mine," the human said. Vekar took a step forward. "Our mother said we would be trained. She didn't say we'd be talked to." "Then let's begin," Mason said, and the longhouse changed. Not with force, no sudden alarms, no drills screamed to life. Instead, the human turned toward a panel and pressed 2 fingers to a sensor pad. The temperature shifted, floor flexed. The lights dimmed into a gradient that made it hard to tell walls from shadows. The smell in the room changed, dampening like the mouth of a cave. "Training day 1, Mason said. Lesson 1. Selly's claws clicked lightly on the floor. "Weapons." "No," Mason said. "Water." The first time the ice beneath them gave way, they did not drop as far as death, but they felt its weight in their bellies. The floor's panels parted, tilted, made chutes where there had been plains. They found themselves scrambling as cold tore at their lungs and their paws skidded on sudden frost. Vekar leapt for a support beam. Jaxra tried to catch Ree and lost him to a slide that ended in a pit lined with soft impact foam. Kren's weight betrayed him. He fell, hit, rolled upright in one breath. Selly rode her fall like a bored god. Mason didn't move, he watched. And when their scrambling stopped, he said, "Lesson 1, grounds change. You have to change with them. Instinct is holy until it isn't. Then you need a habit stronger than fear." "Your floor betrayed us," Kren growled. "Every battlefield is a floor with a different mood," Mason said. "You think rock loves you, you think vacuum is your friend. Nothing underneath you owes you balance, so your legs have to learn to belong anywhere." They hated him that first day, and hatred became heat, and heat became fuel, and fuel became sleepless focus. Mason taught without shouting. He rarely smiled. He fed them early and sparingly, clean proteins, something he called fermented greens, hydration that didn't taste like mountain melt but like the idea of green leaves from a place that remembered summer. He did not praise for trying, only for outcomes, and even then his praise was a nod, a single word. Good. He showed them things they did not ask for, how to wrap hands and paws with tough tapes for grip without losing tactile sense, how to breathe 3 beats in and 2 out when you were running out of air, how to close a slit wound with thermal mesh so the next 30 seconds belonged to you, how to pick up a radio headset like it was a stone and set it down again like it was a promise. He made them run when wind knifed the valley. He made them sleep in a circle with their backs to each other while speakers played the sound of unknown footsteps. He made Vekar stand at the threshold of the longhouse and watch the stars turn, until Vekar understood the shape of the night there so well that when a new streak cut the sky he said, "Ship," before it burned. Mason nodded. He made Selly and Jaxra spar with their shadows, then with each other, then with gloves that had weight in the wrong places until they learned how to be wrong and move anyway. He made Kren do slow, patient things. Kren was power. Mason taught him patience. "You finish first because you start first," Mason told him. "Not because you're strongest. Let the second hand break before your will does." Rihi set to listen. "You're small, you'll be underestimated, perfect. Learn to hear the room, count breaths, name them." Ri began to name the breaths, Mason's, slow and oceanic, Vekar's, steady as a pendulum, Selly's, a dancer's, Jaxra's, often held as if she were tasting the air, Kren's, deep and sometimes sullen. His own, too quick until he learned to slow it. Mason told them stories between exercises, not in the voice of a minstrel, but as if filing reports to an invisible fire. "I was orbital infantry once," he said on the 6th day, binding Kren's wrist. "Then quiet operations, then a mission with no name that lasted too long to still be called a mission. Humans break in the same places anyone does. We just learned how to break forward." "What does that mean?" Selly asked. Mason looked at the window. The nebula looked back, indifferent. "You'll see." The first week taught them how to stand on nothing. The second taught them how to stand together. Mason didn't say team. He did small, cruel things that would be mercy later, locked their food coolers and gave the code to none of them, only to the space between all of them. "A code is 10 hands," he said. "You'll figure it out with 10 minds." They learned Jaxra could hear tones none of them could. She started singing low, almost inaudible, and the keypad returned a chime that meant the digit that wanted to be pressed. Selly remembered sequences like she loved them. Vekar had a sense for patterns as if born with graphs behind his eyes. Kren could stand still for 3 minutes and not blink. Ri noticed that the keypad lit up one side more than the other when Mason stood near, as if the human's heat left shadows. "Look at you," Mason said when the cooler opened. "It almost looks like you could starve alone. Together you can't." He gave them no weapons. He taught them to make weapons from places. "Everything is a lever," he said. "Don't look for something sharp, look for something that wants to move." He rigged the longhouse so that a loose plank became an arm. He weighted rope until it taught them gravity as an ally. He made them build traps that didn't maim but captured. "Nets work," he said. "Nets end fights. We have this human game, soccer. It's a net that makes everybody run, consider that." They didn't know the game, they nodded like they did. Later he showed them footage, old earth, grass that looked like a memory-given color. Armor is heat, pride is weight, to go far you strip. The third week he took them outside, not just into the valley, but onto the ice wastes beyond the ridge where the sky opened so wide it made bravery shy. They carried nothing but water, a roll of thermal mesh, and the weave nets they had made in the longhouse. Mason set the pace, not a sprint but a patience that ate the horizon. They ran for hours, rested for minutes, then ran again. The waste sang a song of no landmarks and too much time. At dusk the wind dropped. You could hear the ice speak its deep language, the thunder rumble of shifting plates, the tiny chime of frost growing on powder. Mason crouched and drew a circle in the snow with one finger. "This is your body," he said, tapping the center. He drew a wider circle around it. "This is your mind. This." He tapped the snow again, tracing a third circle that encompassed them all. "This is your will. You are all born with the first. The second you trained, hunting and learning your world. The third," he pointed at the nebula. "You don't find it until something tries to take it from you." "What will try?" Vekar asked. Mason looked up and the nebula answered with a jagged silver line, silent for a moment, then screaming. The ship was on fire before their eyes acknowledged it. Mason didn't run, he flowed. "Re with me. Others, nets, keep low." He sounded bored almost. The roar came late. The ship's broken belly skated across an invisible line of gravitational jank, and suddenly everything in the valley felt pulled to one side. They crested the next ridge to see the ship's body, a stubby courier with a nose like a hammer, broken across the ice, bleeding sparks. Its hatch coughed smoke. The air smelled of burning wire and animal fear. When the hatch blew, a figure stumbled into the light. Not a human, not one of Sar'Lai's people. Too tall, too thin, legs doubled like a dancer's, eyes a mosaic of blue facets, Feroxy, a transit guild from the outer rings. The Feroxy collapsed, hands clawing at air. Re, thrown forward by Mason's pull, leapt first. Breath, he remembered, 3 in, 2 out. And he pushed his small chest close to the Feroxy's side and breathed loudly as if to lend a cadence. Mason dragged the Feroxy away from the steam of frozen coolant to where the ground held still, then pressed a thermal mend across a wound in the creature's side with movements like turning pages. The others spread as trained. Selly low, Jaxra higher. Vekar ghosted to the flank, Kren behind Mason like a wall that could also be a door. The ship screamed again and another figure came out of the hatch. This one carried a gun. It wasn't much by star standards, no heavier than a sawed pipe, no more complicated than a breech. But it was aimed without doubt or searching, and Mason's head was the center of that aim. The Feroxy's faceted eyes glittered with a different light than shock. A second Feroxy hooded, its hands steady as a metronome. The first training's floors broke because a teacher chose it. The ice broke because it wanted to. "Drop it," Mason said. The second Feroxy's head tilted, listening to a wind that wasn't wind. Then it spoke in trade speech. "We were hunted," it said. "We came down running. You will give us shelter until they pass." "You're pointing a gun at my chest," Mason said, and asking, interesting. The Feroxy's lower lip curled in what could have been a shrug, could have been a threat. "If I fire," it said, "you die." "If you fire," Mason said, "you'll never know what you could have learned here." The Feroxy blinked. Beneath the hood, a twitch, a hesitation born of hearing a shape of sentence alien to this moment, the smallest tremor. Jaxra saw it, she who loved microtones, heard it in the click of the Feroxy's tongue against the palate. She drew breath. "Don't sing," Vekar wanted to say, but Mason saw her throat move and gave the smallest nod. Jaxra sang a single note. It wasn't a melody, it was a truth. The Feroxy's gun arm eased by a hair. Mason moved then, not quickly, not dramatically. He stepped to the side as if the world had shifted and his shoulder touched the Feroxy's wrist, and the weapon slid like it had always wanted to be on the ground. Kren stepped in, the net fell. The second Feroxy landed like a fly caught out of season, tangled and angry. The first Feroxy groaned where Re held its breath for it. "Help," it managed in soft trill. "We are," Mason said. "We're just doing it on our terms." They warmed the feroxy, tended the wounds, one real, one to pride, and fed both from the sparse store Mason had. The one with the gun called itself Quirrin. The wounded one was Tav. Their ship had fled a blockade, they said, but not by choice. The blockade had formed around them like ice around an ankle, and the ships chasing them weren't guild security or pirates playing a game. They wore the wolf brand of Sar'Lai's oldest enemy, the pale kin, star scavengers and hymn screamers who turned other people's sons into graves. "They will come," Quirrin said from within the net, not meeting Mason's eyes. "If you keep us, you bring them." "Everyone who lives brings someone's trouble," Mason said quietly. "Eat." He cut the net loose. "Why?" Quirrin asked, staring. "Because a closed hand can't catch anything," Mason said. "And because we need a real lesson." The pale kin came before dawn, when the Yardarm Nebula lost contrast against the whitening sky. They didn't broadcast threats. They didn't fire warnings. 3 skimmers slid low across the ice, wakes of fine frost rising behind them like cloaks. Their keels were lined with teeth. Their pilots wore helmets that made faces look like smooth stones. The lead skimmer dragged a sled, and in that sled sat an object that made every hair along Vekar's spine rise. It was a field forge, a furnace that ate world iron and sang back silence. When the forge's throat opened, the light inside wasn't light. It was the absence of songs that stars like to sing. Mason looked at the forge and then at the cubs and said very softly, "Do not touch that." He stepped forward, hands open, unarmed to eyes that counted weapons but not wills. The lead skimmer stopped 30 paces away. The pilot's helmet unfolded like a flower, revealing a face that was all cheekbones and no humor. "You hold prey," the pale kin pilot said. "Travelers," Mason corrected. The pilot considered. "Give them, we leave, keep them, and we erase you." "Erase," Mason repeated as if tasting the word. "Erase is a big appetite, and I'm a small meal." The pilot's smile was a wound. He lifted a hand and the 2 flanker skimmers shifted, revealing needle cannons and impatience. Mason did not move. The cubs did not either, because he had told them lesson 2, move together or not at all. The wind shifted. Quirrin, half hidden behind Kren and Jaxra, trembled, eyes sliding to the forge as if it were an old fear returning in a new voice. "What do you want them for?" Mason asked, genuine curiosity touching his tone like frost on glass. "Transit dues," the pilot said. "Guild debt paid in flesh. We recycle old oaths." Mason looked down at the ice for a long breath. Then he looked up and said, "No." It wasn't a shout, it wasn't a plea. It was a word that set like a stone in a river and made new currents think twice about themselves. The pilot sighed as if disappointed that a conversation had ended without sport. The hand lifted, the cannons leveled, the forge's mouth yawned. "Train," Mason said. The valley woke. It's one thing to be taught to beg space to be your ally. It's another to ask it and have it say yes. For 3 weeks the Longhouse had been the world. Now the world returned the favor. The cubs moved. They didn't think of teeth, they thought of levers. Selly's feet found the seam in the ice where meltwater had chewed a soft wall. Her hand set a spike there, one of the small pittons Mason had forced them to carry everywhere. Because unless you have a place to stand, why should the universe listen to you? And the seam became a slit, became a crack, became a line that chose to break in exactly the right direction. Jaxra's voice found the pitch that hummed in the cannon casings. Micro vibrations tickled the barrels off true just as the first salvo fired, and the shots chewed the ice a handbreadth to the left of where the cubs were not. Kren lifted what could not be lifted, the sled chain of the field forge, and he didn't try to throw it. He walked with it slowly, step by step, each step a promise that the chain and he might become the same word for a while. Vekar, moving like night, had broken its rules just for him, slipped under a skimmer's flank and touched a line that Mason had taught him to feel, a line where weight translated to motion. He pressed. The skimmer tipped, not dramatically, a slow, offended tilt, enough for its cannon to cough fire into weather instead of purpose. Ree ran into the forge's shadow and felt the hunger there like a mouth against his ribs. He listened. In the sound of its non-sound, he heard chaos afraid of itself. He threw his net not at the machine, not at the pilot, but at the fence of power lines that hummed like teeth. The net was wrong for electricity. The net didn't know what electricity was, but it was woven with Mason's stubbornness and their practice, and when it hit, not all of it burned. Enough wrapped. Enough sagged. The forge choked. Mason walked forward through shots that found only the spaces he had made for them. He picked up a shard of broken ice with one hand. He lifted it like a salute. He threw it not at a face, but at a throttle. The pilot cursed in a language older than enforcement and younger than gods, and his machine hiccuped. Quirrin, who hadn't run when given the chance, saw Tav's life hanging like a small coin above a drain and roared, an unexpected sound from a quiet throat. The roar did nothing to the pale kin. To Quirrin it did everything. He reached for the net again, not to be caught this time, but to bind a wheel. He pulled. A skimmer kissed the ice with its spilled teeth spat blood made of shining oil. The fight wasn't clean. It wasn't pretty. It was a series of small answers to big, stupid questions like erase. It took minutes that felt like stories. In the end, the forge didn't sing. The skimmers bled into quiet. The pilot, the cheekbone man with the wound of a smile, looked around at a field that had refused to be simple and finally understood that the universe had a sense of humor he hadn't respected. "You are human," he said as if someone had told him a myth. "You'll tell them that," Mason said, face unreadable. "And you'll also tell them this place has a mother with teeth." At the word mother, the wind changed. Something vast moved beyond the ridges, the echo of a wing without a wing. Sar'Lai's shadow crossed the ice. The pale kin left. Mason didn't smile. He said only, "Reset." That night he cooked a soup that tasted like mercy and fatigue. The Feroxy sat near the hearth, eyes dim but alive. Jaxra dozed curled against Selly's flank. Kren slept sitting up with the chain across his lap like a sleeping cat. Vekar watched the door with a stillness that made the door nervous. Recounted breaths. Mason stared at his hands as if reading a map he never wanted to visit again. "You lied," Vekar said finally, quiet. "You said Lesson 1 was changing ground. Lesson 1 is no." Mason looked at him. "Lesson 1 is choosing what you won't give," he agreed. "Everything else organizes itself around that." Quirrin lifted his head. "You could have kept us bound," he said. "You didn't." "I don't know many things," Mason said. "I know this. Trust given isn't about deserving. It's about deciding who you want to be before the test arrives." "You sound like a priest," Selly murmured without opening her eyes. "I've seen enough death to prefer sermons," Mason said. Days turned and bled into each other. The Feroxy repaired their ship under Mason's supervision. The cubs trained in the needs of the day and the needs of the next year. They learned to move blindfolded by smell and memory. They learned to fight without punishment in their hearts because Mason told them punishment was a confession of someone else's authority. "You deal with threats," he said. "You don't punish. If you want more enemies, punish. If you want fewer, end things clearly." They learned to pick up a person who would not be picked up and carry them anyway. They learned that humor isn't a tactic, but sometimes it could be a raft in a river that wanted to keep your shoes. Mason tried jokes that fell flat and didn't mind. The cubs tried jokes that were only pouncing at bad times and learned to time them better. On the 23rd day, Sar'Lai came. She didn't knock. The longhouse's door scar opened because it knew the word mother even in a language she didn't speak. She filled the room like a sudden remembering. Her armor had new scars, powder white against red steel. Her mane was braided with rings that clinked like small bells. Her eyes went to her children and measured them as if weighing a mountain against a mountain. "You smell different," she said, not to them but to the air. Mason stood across from her, hands empty, back straight. He did not bow, he inclined his head. Sar'Lai. Mason Hale, she said, the human name rolling through the architecture of her throat like a stone down a canyon. You trained my blood. I trained anyone who wanted to learn, Mason said. Did they want? She asked, gaze a knife. They do now, he said. She looked at her children. Selly met her mother's eye, Jaxra met the space beside it. Kren lowered his head without lowering anything else. Vekar held, did not blink. Re drew breath to meet that gaze and did not break. Sar'Lai's nostrils flared. Pride tried to steal her severity and failed politely. Your enemy will not wait for you to congratulate each other, Mason said. This is not an enemy, Sar'Lai said without looking at him. This is a measure. Vekar stepped forward. Mother, he said, and then realized the word was too small for the distance between them. Sar'Lai, he echoed, and the old and the new name stood together like 2 feet of a stride. What do you know now? Sar'Lai asked. That you did not know when you first howled at a sky and thought it would listen. Vekar did not answer with technique. Not about levers or nets or the pitch of cannon barrels. He said, we know what we won't give. Sar'Lai's ears flicked. And what is that? Each other, Selly said softly. Sar'Lai looked at Mason. Your work smells of you. I had help, Mason said. The floor, the wind, a misplaced forge, your children's stubbornness. Sar'Lai's face moved in a way that could have been a smile if it had slower hands. I did not bring tribute, she said. I brought employment. The pale kin are not finished. They want the valley and the paths behind it. They have begun to sing to my people's supply lines. They claim the nebula's fringe as prayer ground. They will not keep to ships. They will walk. Mason's face did not change. Then we get to teach them. Humans love to teach, Sar'Lai said. We love to remember, Mason said. Sometimes we mark our lessons in other people. Bring them, Sar'Lai said to her children. I do not know who you are now, show me. They went to war, not the kind the galaxy sells in drama halls, where ships spin like dancers and light makes art of murder. This was ground-born, bone close to the planet's breath. The pale kin came not because they loved ground, but because they hated leaving anything unsupported by their god of clean erasure. They moved in formations that had swallowed colonies on 6 worlds. They came with more skimmers, with walkers that moved like cold mountains hurrying, with drones that sang a note meant to kill courage. The valley had opinions. The longhouse had learned from Mason. The valley had learned from ice. It remembered necessities and forgot rest. It opened places at wrong times to beasts that didn't look down often enough. The cubs were not cubs. Sar'Lai's soldiers watched them with the narrow eyes of professionals who had seen children die and would not be charmed by myth. Yet they saw Vekar go where the map didn't say there was a place, and return with a route that let a platoon become a rumor, and then an ambush, and then a fallen walker on its side like an embarrassed god. They saw Selly run into the space between 2 lines of fire and weave a rope out of not dying and pull a wounded soldier through it with one hand like she was threading a needle. They heard Jaxra's voice, not song for pleasure, but for purpose, shivering through the frame of a drone until its friend fire went wide. They watched Kren stop a skimmer with his hands. He wasn't stronger than the machine, but he was more patient than the cowardice of the driver, and patience is heavier than speed. He held, dug his feet into the ice as if he were telling the planet, now would be a good time, and the planet obliged, juddering upward in a small swell that kissed the skimmer's undercarriage and made it think about air differently. The machine tipped. The soldier inside met Sar'Lai's blade, and Sar'Lai's blade met a hymn, and the hymn learned to shut up. Re did small, astonishing things. He crawled under the skirts of walkers and learned their breaths. He counted the rhythm of a power plant's hum and slipped a net not over a weapon, but over a vent. He listened to boots and knew where the next line would form. He saved men who would never know they were saved. He saved Quirren when the Feroxy insisted on paying back salvation with clumsy bravery. He shouted one word he learned from Mason at a moment when fear was a question, and the word was no. No turned shots aside because the hands that pulled the triggers wavered when they heard their own mother tongues inside that word. The pale kin priest came with a lantern on a pole, light-spitting silence, singing a non-song that made Sar'Lai's soldiers put hands to ears and eyes to ground. Mason went to meet him alone. Sar'Lai swore softly, but she let him walk. She was not his mother, she was his employer. An employment you pay for with letting people do their work. The priest was tall, the lantern was heavy, the light carved the air. "You are mistake," the priest said, words lacquered with certainty. Mason stopped within the light's edge. It licked his scars and decided they were not interesting. "We all are," he said. The priest raised his lantern. The song deepened. Mason closed his eyes. He remembered a city that had to be emptied one brick at a time because a god had already eaten its shadows. He remembered another light, the kind that warms a kitchen, and his mother saying, "When men make a big show of holy words, it's because they want to hide the small truth in their pocket." Mason opened his eyes. "Your light scares children," he said. "Put it down." The priest smiled the smile of people who have forgotten what teeth are for. The lantern lifted higher. Mason stepped into the light. The song pressed his eardrums, his balance faltered. Nausea rose like an old friend late to a party. He put one hand on the lantern's pole and pushed, not with strength, but with the insistence of someone who has decided a piece of furniture looks better against the other wall. The lantern tilted. The song rolled. The light shivered as if it had just realized it was still just a lamp that hurt to look at. Mason pressed steadily, nothing dramatic. The priest's eyes widened because nobody had ever done anything steady to his god before, and some gods cannot stand that. The lantern's base met ice. It hissed. It cracked the surface. The crack ran, like cracks do, toward places it had been thinking about anyway. The priest tried to pull the lantern back and found that nothing wanted to be near it. Not the ground, not the air, not his own hands, which meant he had to hold tighter and closer. And that meant the cold ate him faster. His hymn became a hiss. His breath became a steam. He dropped the pole. The lantern fell. The light went out with an offended sound. Mason stepped back. The priest stared at the puddle of failed holiness and then at the human and saw the shape of a future he'd never imagined, one where someone simply refused to decorate their terror. "Leave," Mason said, and the priest left, not because he was afraid, but because his story had a hole that had to be sewn before it could be told again. War lasted 11 days. The valley kept them up and then gave them to sleep like a mother who understands that a lullaby is diagnostic. The children who were not children stopped being called the cubs. They were given new names in the barracks gossip that meant things like door, like not, like echo that doesn't go away when the singer dies. Sar'Lai watched, not from a hill with a flag, but next to her soldiers in holes that smelled of old sweat and mountain spice. When she fought, the field moved aside. When she spoke to her children, it was always when they were almost too tired to argue and most honest with their eyes. "You are not the pieces I carved," she said one night, cleaning the edge of her blade with the care of a prayer. "You are something I did not expect." Vekar, who had thought for years his mother possessed the map of him, felt a piece of himself he hadn't noticed relax like a hand unclenching. "We don't know what we are either," he said, "but we know what we won't give." Sar'Lai's mouth moved into that almost smile again. "That sentence has a human infection. We're contagious," Mason said behind her, setting down a tin cup of tea. "Ask history." On the 12th day, quiet fell so hard that the first hour after felt like it might break. The pale kin had retreated past the ridge lines, past the shadow of the forged sleds, past the memory of the lantern light. The valley hummed in its old language. The wind softened. Someone laughed and stopped themselves, as if laughter might offend the dead. Sar'Lai stood and raised her head. She let out a long, low sound that people later called a song because they didn't know what else to call the noise a predator makes when it thanks a place. The feroxy left in a ship that no longer bled. Quirrin sat in the hatch and looked back at Mason and said, "Trust given is about deciding who you are before the test arrives." Good line, Mason said. Use it on someone who thinks they can't do the right thing because the papers are complicated. Quirrell laughed with only one corner of his mouth and shook his head. You do not train warriors, he said. You train weather. That's too kind, Mason said. Too true, Quirrell said, and the hatch closed. After the quiet, after the soup, after the sleep that lasted midnights inside afternoons, Sar'Lai came to the longhouse. She looked at the walls, at the scuffs where nets had snagged, at the dents where patience had taught weight to respect it. She looked at Mason. What do I owe you? She asked. Bring me a book, Mason said. Any book that's older than me, I've reread mine to death. Sar'Lai blinked. You want stories. Weapons dull, Mason said. Wills don't, stories sharpen wills. She didn't nod, but something like one passed through her posture. And my children, Mason said nothing. He looked at Vekar, at Selly, Jaxra, Krenri. He gestured with his head out there over that ridge where the world that hadn't yet tried to kill them waited. They're ready, he said, not to win, to endure. Sar'Lai's eyes softened a fraction of a degree. Your kind has a talent for that. We learned from our planets, Mason said. They tried to kill us first. She didn't argue. She went to her children. She stood very close, and now she did bow, not deeply, not in front of the taste of a crowd, but with a heat that made the longhouse remember other fires. I sent you to be broken, she said. You returned unrecognizable. I don't know yet if I like it. I like that I don't know. Re lifted his chin. We're still us, he said, just faster at being us. Who taught you to say things like that? Sar'Lai asked, but she didn't look at Mason. She looked at the door, as if some other visitor had said it earlier in the day. They stayed. Mason kept them longer than anyone had planned. Not to correct techniques, not to add a final polish, but because leaving is a skill too, and he wanted to show them how to do it without tearing places like bad bandages. He took them to a ridge no visitor ever came to without a story in their pocket. The Yardarm Nebula spread like a bruise. The planet's two moons had chased each other to opposite corners of a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to be night or day. Every war ends, Mason said. Some end because you win. Some end because the world gets bored. Some end in a hospital bed with an argument about a bill. Most end without telling you the final score. That's unsatisfying, Kren said. Good, Mason said. Satisfaction makes you slow. Jaxra touched the frozen crest of a snow wave as if trying to learn its song. What did you endure? She asked Mason under the wind, before us. Having to decide again and again to be the same person in different rooms, Mason said, You'll know that one. They did. They would. They were already someone else in the field than in the longhouse, someone else to Sar'Lai than to each other, someone else when they were the only person awake, and the ship's low hum made memory taste like salt. They did not complain. They breathed 3 in and 2 out. When they left, carrying in their shoulders new rearrangements of weight and in their eyes the kind of patience that scares people who like certainty, Sar'Lai stood at the airfield without ceremony. She did not hug. She did not say the old goodbye that meant, I may need to fight you one day. She said, return unrecognizable again. We will, Vekar said. They did. The pale kin did not end. They folded into larger swarms and learned mistakes slowly, like a glacier learns to turn. Other hungers arrived, the kind that sell legitimacy by the kilo, the kind that call themselves companies but wear boots at the ends of their decisions, the kind that arrive with treaties in one hand and forges in the other. The children of Sar'Lai moved through these like needles through fabric, sometimes nodding, sometimes unpicking, sometimes leaving a color that nobody could name but everyone recognized. They returned to the longhouse not with bows or songs but with news. Mason listened. He asked questions only after they slept, and he asked only 1 or 2. He cooked soups that tasted like rooms after rain. He read the book Sar'Lai brought, poems in a language that tasted like iron and honey, and he whistled when a line knocked a door open inside him. He grew older in a way that made his scars look like roads on a map that had become less useful because the landscape had decided to move. One winter, A different winter, when the ice had formed a cathedral on the lake, and the wind sounded like a choir that had lost its music, the longhouse door opened to a new voice. It wasn't Sar'Lai. It wasn't her children. It was a small group cloaked in dust and hope, the last of a mining colony from the far side of the nebula. They found the human they'd heard rumors of and stood in his doorway with their hands empty of weapons and full of lost things. "Are you the man who teaches Will?" the smallest of them asked, comparing Mason to a rumor and finding that rumors leave a lot out. "I'm a guy who cooks and makes floors misbehave," Mason said. "What do you need?" "We need to endure," the small one said. "They're taking our water." Mason sighed like someone who has known too many kinds of theft. He nodded. "All right." He sent for Sar'Lai. He sent for her children. He sent for anyone who had learned to be a lever when the world tried to be a weight. They came, not because a human ordered them, but because the valley had become a kind of temple for a religion nobody wanted to name in case naming it made it fashionable. They taught the miners what ground meant. They taught them the word no. They taught them songs that made drones doubt themselves. They taught them to move in the spaces a corporation doesn't imagine because imagination is not a line item in a budget. They took the water back. They guarded it. They built a net that wasn't rope but law, with knots made of eyes and stories, and they hung it not over the sky but over the offices where decisions cooled into harm. Papers tore or turned into better papers. A lantern got turned off. A forge was repurposed for warmth. Years earned themselves like scars that people could admire later. The longhouse saw children born and old soldiers sit and talk about soup. The valley gained a curve in its reputation, a place where if you came, you left recognizing yourself less and liking yourself more. Nobody called it that. They called it the place with the human who keeps looking at your hands and listening to your breathing. Maybe they didn't want to admit they were coming for something like redemption. The Yardarm Nebula kept looking like a wound even when nothing was bleeding. Sar'Lai grew old, which is to say she kept her sharpness but set it down more often, like a knife you only carry when you go into the alley you know has a habit. Her children became generals and ghosts and farmers with secrets and poets who minted steel. They returned, again and again, unrecognizable not because they had become strangers to goodness, but because they had upgraded what goodness looked like under stranger weather. One night, many years after the first training and the first fight and the first no, Re came alone. He was no longer small. He had a limp that he had decided was fashionable. He held a book. He placed it on Mason's table. "Your book," he said, "you underline too much." Mason smiled with the corner of his mouth that hadn't forgotten how. "I'm greedy." Re sat. Listened to the human breathing 3 in, 2 out because old habits had married the lungs. "Why did you stay?" Re asked. "You could have gone anywhere that paid more and offered titles. People love titles. They add them to signatures as if they ward off dying." Mason looked at the longhouse ceiling at the beams that had learned all their names. "Because someone sent me a request that wasn't about conquest," he said. "It was about endurance. That felt correct." Re put his head down like a wolf cub in a story who trusts the fire to be kind. "I thought humans wanted to conquer," he said, teasing. "Sometimes," Mason said. "Sometimes we remember that winning is mostly a polite word for someone else's losing. Enduring is a slyer word. It doesn't require anyone else to fail." Re closed his eyes and let the warmth of the longhouse, the winter beyond it, the breath that belonged to both of them, stitch the old lesson to old bones. "We returned unrecognizable," he said. "Do you ever worry we unlearn ourselves?" "Unlearning is a tool," Mason said. "Just don't unlearn your no." The door scar opened without a word. The night smelled of iron and clean cold. The nebula wore the same ripped silk it had worn the first night. Mason stood, joint speaking. He stared at the sky until the stars felt seen. "It's funny," he said, not for humor. "People come here and ask how to be strong. I show them how to be present. Then they leave and call that strength." Re huffed something like a laugh. Then keep being present, he said. We'll keep mislabeling it and the universe will keep being surprised. Mason nodded. Deal. When Sar'Lai died, 3 winters later, on a day that pretended to be spring just long enough to give her a good last cent, the valley gathered with a dignity that never learned the word ceremony but understood it. They didn't build a pyre. They set her armor up like a house and let wind live in it. Her children stood, unrecognizable, 11 times over. Mason stood too, hands in sweater pockets, eyes that had failed at crying enough times to know their own stubbornness. He did not speak. He did not need to, after Vekar came to him. We need a new teacher, he said, half a question. You don't, Mason said gently. You just need to keep teaching. Vekar looked at his hands. They had enough scars to qualify as maps. And you? I'm tired, Mason said and then smiled. Which is my body's way of telling me I'm about to do something stupid like start again. Start what? Making floors misbehave, Mason said. There are so many floors. Vekar nodded. There is a rumor, he said, that the pale kin are calling a council. They want to trade their lanterns for looms. They say the word build without trying to drink the vowels from it. Good, Mason said. They can bring their looms here. The valley needs new nets. Do you forgive them? Vekar asked, and there was no romance in the query. Only curiosity, like a scientist looking at a new stone. I don't know, Mason said. Forgiveness requires memory that doesn't sting every time, and mine stings. But I can sit next to them without about to flinch in my shoulders. That's a progress report. And we can work. Work is sometimes better than forgiveness at making the world nicer to live in. Vekar accepted this as if it were a recipe and he had all the ingredients. We'll bring them, he said, and they did. The pale kin came wearing clothes that could get paint on them. They brought metal that wanted to be bridges. They brought songs that apologized without changing scale. The valley let them in. The longhouse learned more names. Nets hung from rafters for the lessons. On days without lessons, they held wildflowers in jars. They made a forge that sang warmth instead of silence. They wrote laws with room to breathe. The human aged. He grew slower. He smiled at sunsets more, at victories less. He learned to love a chair by the door and the old cup with a chip that made the tea taste humble. He taught fewer drills and more words. He taught new children of new species how to breathe without stealing anyone else's air. When people thanked him, he nodded as if they had told him the weather, and he was grateful to know whether to bring a hat. On the last night anyone remembered him as young, though he wasn't. There was a storm that whispered instead of shouting. The nebula hid. The moon sulked. The valley went to sleep early. Mason sat in the door and watched the snow fall like someone carefully reconsidering a letter before sending it. Ree, now older than his first fear, sat beside him. They didn't talk for a long time. Finally, Ree said, "Tell me again, lesson 1. Mason smiled without showing teeth because he'd never quite learned to. Decide what you won't give, he said, and keep something to laugh with. Laughter, Ree asked. Yeah, Mason said, because grief will come. If you don't have a hand to hold when it does, you'll hold anything, and anything is usually a weapon pointed backwards. Ree nodded. I'll teach that wrong and they'll understand it right. Good, Mason said. That's the only way it sticks. Years fold like maps in pockets we forget to check. There are too many battles to list, too many winters to catalog, too many soups to remember the names of. But if someone asked the valley to declare itself, it would declare nothing but this: that when the predator sent its cubs to a human for training, what came back wasn't warriors or saints or anything convenient to hire. What came back was weather. The kind that refuses to be tame and refuses to be cruel. The kind that grows crops and ruins parades with rain but saves lives by keeping wildfires decent. The kind that makes you plan less for ceremonies and more for work that matters. And in a galaxy that mistakes conquest for language, the valley learned a new dialect. It sounded like boots worn to softness, like nets thrown with care, like lamps turned off quietly, like forges rewritten into hearths. It sounded like no and yes said at exactly the right times. It sounded like breathing 3 in and 2 out. It sounded like a laughter that never apologized for taking up room. The longhouse still stands. When you come, the door will open if you tell it a word that means mother in any tongue. Inside, there will be a human or a memory of one, and there will be the smell of tea. You will be told that weapons dull and wills don't. You will be asked, not demanded, asked, to decide what you won't give. If you are unlucky, you'll be sent into a storm. If you are lucky, you'll come back unrecognizable to people who needed you to stay small. You will not conquer. You will endure. And the map of the galaxy, which insists on being printed in the language of empires, will have to learn to make space on the margin for a valley surrounded by names for patience. On the kind of night that belongs to old heroes and new children, when the nebula looked less like a wound and more like a banner someone forgot to furl, when Quirryn's grandchildren played net tag between the legs of a walker that now served as a climbing frame, when the pale kin priest's lantern hung as a plant holder in the corner of a shop that sold tools for building bridges, Mason stood at the threshold and breathed. He looked tired and pleased in the way mountains get when songbirds keep singing anyway. He put his hand on the door. The door hummed back. Somewhere on a ridge beyond sense, the wind made an oath and kept it. Somewhere under a mountain of someone else's map, men in offices frowned and felt a draft they couldn't name. Mason smiled his small, complicated smile and said into the valley, which is to say into the world, which is to say into anyone who would stand in a doorway and think about stepping out. One last truth he had learned by breaking forward so many times it had become a religion. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.